Now this part we'll talk about the oral cavity, pharynx, esophagus, and the stomach. So we'll start off with the oral cavity, where there is saliva that comes out, and we have the 3 pairs of salivary glands, and those are your sublingual, found underneath the tongue, the submandibular, and that is found under the mandible or under the lower jaw, and the parotid salivary glands, and those are found by the ears. All of them have different ducts, and those ducts are going to pour the saliva into the oral cavity. We also, through the oral cavity behind it, will get into the pharynx, through the oropharynx, and then down the esophagus. The esophagus will go through the esophageal hiatus of the diaphragm, which is an opening in the diaphragm, in order to reach the stomach. Now, what is the composition and the function of saliva? So the different components are water, and water helps in moistening food and helps in dissolving the molecules and stimulating your chemoreceptors and stimulating your taste buds. The mucus lubricates food and helps make a bolus of food. So when food is chewed up and mixed up with saliva and with the mucus included, we are now going to call it a bolus, and that's what we swallow. Saliva also has bicarbonate ions, and that helps to neutralize some of the acidity in food, and it also neutralizes the bacterial, the acid coming out of the bacteria that is usually found within the oral cavity. Saliva has lysozymes, which is an enzyme that helps in killing bacteria to maintain healthy gums and teeth. Saliva has 2 enzymes, 2 digestive enzymes. Those are salivary amylase, that starts the digestion of polysaccharides, and salivary lipase, that starts the digestion of triglycerides. And the reason I specify that they are salivary, whether amylase or lipase, because we have other amylases and lipases in other parts of the digestive system, and to specify that these are the ones that are found within the oral cavity, we name them salivary amylase or salivary lipase. Now for the swallowing reflex. So we start off after chewing the food. The first part of swallowing at least, is voluntary, which is the movement of the tongue backwards to push the food or push that bolus towards the oropharynx. So this right here is the oropharynx, which is all the way in the back of the oral cavity. That part is voluntary, but once the receptors, the pressure receptors in the oropharynx are stimulated, that is going to stimulate your reflex, your swallowing reflex, and everything else goes automatically. Okay, everything else is a reflex that we really have no control over. The reflex, the center of the swallowing reflex is in the medulla oblongata, and you can see here it is basically made out of making sure that the food goes down the esophagus and not down the trachea or the windpipe, which is right in front or anterior to the esophagus. So it really includes that bending down, as you can see here, of the epiglottis in order to cover the trachea. It also includes that elevation of the soft palate, okay, to close the nasal cavity, so that the food doesn't go through upwards towards the nasal cavity. So when you close the nasal cavity and the trachea, the food really has only one way to go, and that is down the esophagus. And then it is by the local peristaltic waves of the esophagus, and that is how, and by gravity too, that's how the bolus, whether it is a food bolus or a liquid, goes down the esophagus until it reaches the stomach. Now these are the parts of the stomach. Right here we have the entrance, okay, and there is a sphincter there known as the lower esophageal sphincter that is normally shut down, so it is normally contracted. When we swallow, that sphincter relaxes in order to receive the food into the stomach. There is another sphincter, and that is the exit of the stomach, known as the pyloric sphincter, and that controls emptying, stomach emptying. The stomach also has that little curve known as the lesser curvature and a long curve known as the longer curvature. The stomach is made out of different parts. There's the fundus, which is the upper dome. There is the body of the stomach, and this part is responsible for secretion of mucus, pepsinogen, and hydrochloric acid. And then there's the antrum, which is the lowermost part of the stomach that is really responsible for a lot of the motility and mixing that happens within the stomach. It also secretes mucus and pepsinogen, but in addition to those, it secretes gastrin. We'll move on to the gastric glands that are found within the stomach. So the stomach is full of glands, and as you've seen, different parts of the stomach secrete different things. So this right here is kind of known as the gastric pit. This would be your stomach, the lumen of the stomach. This is where the food is found in, or now it's called a bolus. And these are the cells lining that gastric pit, and all of these cells make different things. So let's take it from the bottom up. So we have these chief cells. These chief cells secrete pepsinogen, and notice it is pepsinogen and not pepsin. So pepsinogen is an inactive form of pepsin. It is going to later generate pepsin, and it needs hydrochloric acid in order to activate it. ECL cells. ECL stands for enterochromaffin-like cells, and they secrete histamine. Histamine is going to act as a paracrine hormone that will stimulate G cells. G cells aren't really shown on here, but it'll stimulate G cells, and G cells secrete gastrin. Moving up forwards, we've got these parietal cells. Parietal cells secrete hydrochloric acid and intrinsic factor. And then all the way up here, we have mucus cells, and these mucus cells secrete mucus, obviously, and bicarbonate, and those are the protective layer of the stomach. So that mucus and bicarbonate is going to protect the stomach from all of that hydrochloric acid that's being secreted. We need to introduce these D cells as well, and those secrete secretin. Now we mentioned how the chief cells make pepsinogen, and we mentioned how it needs to be activated by that hydrochloric acid. So you can see here we kind of simplified the gastric pit into a chief cell and a parietal cell. Parietal cell secretes hydrochloric acid and intrinsic factor. Intrinsic factor is extremely important for the absorption of vitamin B12 in an autoimmune condition known as pernicious anemia. These individuals would have autoantibodies against that parietal cell, so they are unable to make intrinsic factor. They cannot absorb vitamin B12, and that leads to megaloblastic anemia, also known as pernicious anemia. And they would also have the inability to produce hydrochloric acid, so their digestion of protein would be affected. Now back to the activation of pepsinogen. So you have that chief cell making pepsinogen. Again, it is an inactive enzyme that needs to be activated by hydrochloric acid into pepsin. And then pepsin is going to break down that polypeptide into smaller peptide chains. Now, how does the parietal cells, how do they make hydrochloric acid? So let's take a look first and understand what we're looking at. So this right here is your parietal cell. This is the lumen of the stomach, so that makes it your apical membrane. And these are where the blood vessels are, so that is your basolateral membrane. Now inside of the cell, we are always making carbon dioxide as a waste product, and that carbon dioxide, it will combine with water to make carbonic acid, or H2CO3, and that is mediated by an enzyme known as carbonic anhydrase enzyme. Now that H2CO3 will break down into hydrogen ions and bicarbonate ions. So let's follow that hydrogen ion first. That hydrogen ion will be kicked out of the cell using this pump known as the hydrogen potassium ATPase pump. So it'll kick out the hydrogen, and potassium will be kicked into the cell, and it is an active pump that needs ATP. So that is the hydrogen portion of hydrochloric acid. Now we need to get the chloride ion. We'll do so through the exchange here of that bicarbonate, which is an anion or a negative ion. We'll kick it out of the cell, in exchange for a negative chloride ion. That chloride will then, through its own tunnel or through its own ion channel, will exit the cell and then unite with that hydrogen to become HCl, or hydrochloric acid. Whenever the parietal cell wants to make or needs to make more hydrochloric acid, it does so through the activation of that hydrogen-potassium pump. So again, the faster that pump goes, the more hydrochloric acid is being made. If too much hydrochloric acid is being made, the cell would have to inhibit that hydrogen-potassium pump. So it's really all up to how fast or slow that pump is going. So you can see here the humoral regulation of the parietal cell, and how do we regulate how much hydrochloric acid we're making. Again, it all depends on the activity of the hydrogen potassium ATPase pump found within the parietal cell. So you have all of these hormones: gastrin, histamine, and acetylcholine, which is your neurotransmitter in the parasympathetic nervous system. All of those are going to stimulate that pump, so it'll increase our acid secretion, while somatostatin is the only one that inhibits that pump and decreases the amount of hydrogen chloride or of hydrochloric acid secretion. And you can see here how an antihistamine can help in decreasing stomach acidity. So the control of hydrochloric acid secretion during a meal. So remember, we have the three phases: cephalic, gastric, and intestinal phase. So through the first two phases, these are the phases where you're either preparing to eat in the cephalic phase or actually starting to eat. So food is going into the stomach, and that is your gastric phase. And in both of those phases, you want to increase the hydrochloric secretion of the hydrochloric acid. So in the cephalic phase, we do so through the parasympathetic stimulation to the enteric nervous system, while the gastric phase, we have direct, those long and short neural reflexes that we talked about. Those are going to directly stimulate gastrin secretion, which one of the actions of gastrin was to increase HCl secretion. The only phase that decreases HCl secretion is the intestinal phase, meaning that the stomach is now empty, and that chyme is now flowing within the small intestine. So we no longer need hydrochloric acid in the stomach. So the intestinal contents, whether it's just the mere distension of the wall or the hydrogen ions due to that hydrochloric acid, increased osmolarity, increased nutrient concentration. So basically things passing through the duodenum would lead to the secretin and CCK, and both of those decrease your hydrochloric acid secretions. So that was about the secretion, gastric secretion. Now what about gastric motility? Well, we have the myenteric plexus that controls that. The myenteric plexus has, they kind of have their own pacemakers. And the pacemakers can, as we know, can make their own local potential that might reach an action potential. So they have the ability to produce their own action potentials without kind of like the input from the CNS. Pacemaker goes at about 3 action potentials per minute. They spread through these gap junctions because, again, they want to be organized. And they only really reach threshold in the presence of a neural and hormonal input. So those pacemakers are going to keep on making those graded potentials, but unless there's actually something within the stomach that leads to neural input or hormonal input, they are not going to reach a full-blown action potential. Before they start moving, while we're actually eating, the stomach has to relax in order to take in the food as we swallow. And that is known as receptive relaxation, meaning the stomach is relaxed in order to receive the food. That happens when we swallow, and it is mediated or occurs because or thanks to the parasympathetic nervous system. Also, the local enteric neurons. So remember, those myenteric neurons release nitric oxide and serotonin, and those help in the relaxation of the smooth muscles. Remember, that is the exact same serotonin that we talked about when we were discussing the nervous system. And that is why, there is this kind of connection between your nervous system and your stomach. The antrum is really the part of the stomach that does those very strong contractions in order to mix the bolus with all that food that we just ate with all of those secretions. The stronger the contractions, when we get to these very strong contractions, that is going to open up the pyloric sphincter, allowing now that chyme to pass into the duodenum. And we get those stronger contractions either after a big meal due to stomach distension and the stimulation of those stretch receptors, and also in the presence of gastrin. So gastrin, increases secretion, it increases motility, and again, leading to those very forceful antral contractions that will eventually lead to the opening of the pyloric sphincter. So that ends this portion. I'll see you in the next.